tell you about. And then at the end, we'll like after about 24 minutes, we're going to go into this sort of yeah, you've seen it, I think. It just there's a just chatting where we just kind of touch base for a few minutes. I'm starting to do these post show kind of discussions with outside people, and so Brianna Castro is coming on after your show, and
Nice.
we're going to dissect what you said and all the things that were wrong, and so we'll just kind of really
I love it.
right. Um, is she out there? Let me check. You don't can't see it. There she is. Yet she's going to be watching this, and then she'll come on, and we'll just AR's nuts. Nothing's going to happen. People will stay, and they'll be responsible, and it's just there's no need to have managed retreat. You know.
Oh no, I love it. Some of those projects I'm most excited about right now are me just disagreeing with people about various concepts and whatnot. It's like, oh, I think you're totally nuts about that. All right, let's write a paper where we just disagree. Um,
Well, I had a
it's pretty
conversation
fun.
early this morning. I don't know if you've crossed paths with her. Carly Purdom at Texas A&M. She does natural hazards and
I know the name, but I don't think I've met her.
but one of her areas she focuses on are prisons and how prisons are adapting to climate change. And we chatted,
That's where I've seen the paper. Yeah, she wrote a paper on like how prisons are so terribly prepared for
right?
disasters like COVID, and yeah.
Well, I brought up managed retreat to her, and I said I was talking to you, and I'm going to give you if we have time, might do a prison question. If you have anything intelligent to say around that, so
Oh,
it's all right.
I don't know. Thanks for the
Well,
warning, though. I'll try to come up with something
Well,
good.
just maybe this will give you something to ponder. Just like what I brought up to her is she was describing the process of moving prisoners, evacuating prisoners. You just like, the government, whoever form or private prisons, are responsible for, the care, the health, the food, the moving, literally everything about moving people. Whereas on the, if you're outside in society, there's a lot of, faith that people will do the right. Oh, they're going to evacuate. Oh, they're going to take care of themselves. They're going to get their own food. And are there any lessons to be learned in like managed retreat in the prison system? Even though they don't do it good right now, if they do get better at it, like when you have this, it's almost like a control group, right? If you can control for like everything that it requires to move people and shifting, and we learn from that. So um, it's almost a thought experiment. Like you've got prisoners, and you're absolutely responsible for everything, right?
Yeah. No, you have total control. And I think that's, well, I mean, yeah, it's not an area I've looked at, but I can say, like, moving prisons on the one hand, easy, right? Because it's I mean, government property. And yeah, you have total control of these people and their living conditions. On the other hand, moving them like far away from their loved ones and their community could be like, that's an additional punishment. And is that something that, there's a lot of concerns around that, right? That raises a lot of justice issues that aren't just about. I mean, I think that actually really nicely illustrates the complexity of moving. That it's not just, oh, of course we should move all the prisons to safe land. It's also, well, will they ever be able to visit, or receive visitors from their families? And what does it do if they can't? And if we move them out to the middle of nowhere and they can't ever integrate, what does that look like? Um, yeah,
Yeah.
I don't know. I mean, it's why it's such a complicated issue. It's fascinating.
Well, and we were talking about even triggers, like let's say a storm event, like what are the triggers to actually move prisoners? And she was saying like it really has to be a high bar in some areas. Like in New Orleans, like the warden or whoever was just like, nah, we don't need to evacuate these people. They'll be fine. And it's just like
Yeah.
there's really no uniform metric to sort of say, okay, this is a category 2 storm or higher. We need to move it. There's nothing like that apparently.
Yeah. I mean, for voluntary or mandatory evacuations, it's hard to set those lines. And that's actually mandatory evacuations have come up in a conversation having people about like, should we force people to relocate away from the coast, right? Should it be totally voluntary? Or is there a point at which we should force people to leave the way we might try to have a mandatory evacuation, right? Or force people to leave during a storm. Um, and what does that look like, right? What's the government responsibility to say, not only do we think you should move away from the coast, but we're going to make you move away from the coast from these risks?
Oh, I just think it's a timing issue. I think we will force people. It's all a matter of timing. The question is like when will we force, not if. Just it's coming.
Yeah.
Florida.
And who will we force, which will be a
Right.
big one too. Yeah.
Climate justice. Okay, I want to get a couple things. Sure.
have to move all the clicky things away from my reach. Otherwise, I click pens and play with things. And on Zoom, I realize that's a big problem.
Okay. Got 3-4 minutes here.
Are you still in Arizona these days?
Yeah, Tucson.
Okay.
We had an awful summer. It was very hot, no monsoons, and so it took away all the joy of the monsoon season. And it was actually quite warm into the fall, but now we're in, pinch me, it's perfect weather because you guys have your winters, and I am, it's going to be 88 degrees today, and that sounds hot, but it's delightful here. So.
I was going to say, the fact that you think 88 is delightful, like, good. I couldn't handle that.
But the thing is, it took me time to get adjusted. I grew up in Florida and lived in very humid areas. And so, like, if it's 95 for that day and it's very humid, 7:30 in the morning, you walk outside, you're just like, ugh. Here, like, it might drop to 55 degrees. And then all of a sudden, it takes till 2 p.m. to get to 88. And so you just have such stunning weather. And then quickly it starts to drop again. It's been a weird kind of adjustment, but it's spectacular weather in the winter. Love it.
I always like that in California, in the dry heat, you can step into shade and it's cooler, right? Because you don't have that sticky.
Same here. The moment like it's 100 degrees and you step into that shade, and it's. I always joke, it's always a good hair day here in Arizona. Florida just poof helmet. So.
No, that's true. Yeah, we don't live quite in the swamp, but we're so close to the swamp that, of course, it's just sticky here, like always.
All right, and you probably didn't expect you were going to talk about good hair days on the Simpatico channel, but I feel like I know you, so we can go there.
The important climate change issues.
Right. We are about to get started. Let me just get a few things ready. Fun. All right, so let's get started, okay? Again, it'll be some silence for a little bit, but it will be completely obvious when we get started. So I'll see you on the other side.
Sounds good.
Hey Adapters, welcome back. We have an exciting episode for you. Our guest is Dr. A.R. Siders. A.R. is an assistant professor in the Biden School of Public Policy and Administration, Geography and Spatial Sciences, and Disaster Research Center at the University of Delaware. She studies climate change adaptation with a focus on equity and managed retreat. He holds a JD from Harvard and a PhD from Stanford. A.R. will stress how adapting is a social justice issue. She provides her insights into managed retreat and explores the various ways it can occur. AR will emphasize the importance of immediate managed retreat planning and shares how communities can decide where managed retreat can take place. Hey there, AR. Welcome to the show.
Hey, Doug. Thanks for having me on. Thanks for having these conversations.
Well, you and I have chatted about managed retreat before, and it's always a pleasure to have you on. And, I guess, how did you get into managed retreat? What your background and such, but how did you get into this field?
So I got into managed retreat because I was living in New York City during Hurricane Sandy, and I was working at the Sabin Center for Climate Change Law at Columbia. And I'd actually just started in September, and we were trying to figure out what kind of adaptation work I'd be doing. And then Sandy hit in October. So it was perfect timing from making it clear what I was going to do with the next year of my life. So I worked on post-Sandy recovery, and there were all of these conversations about where do we rebuild and how do we rebuild, all these conversations about when we rebuild and how we rebuild, and not conversations about where we rebuild or about should we rebuild. right? And so starting talking to these local officials who would say, oh, we can't do managed retreat. That's not American, or that's not legal, or that's not something we do here. And I knew that we had decades of experience doing this. And so that started me on this path of, why do we think this, right? Why do people think that this is new? Why do they think that why is it so problematic, right? And so, yeah, that just really got me intrigued about how we think about these kinds of policies and how we can use them more effectively.
Sandy was a catalyst, I think, for a lot of these conversations. But actually, even the terminology of managed retreat, I mean, I'm putting you on the spot. Do you know where that started? I mean,
I don't know the origins of it. So I know several people have looked at this. It's been around for several decades at least. I mean, back, at least into the mid 1900s. It seems to be used in some ecology work and also in engineering. So we talk about moving buildings, or you talk about ecosystems that are sort of moving away from coastal issues or other hazards. But I don't know where the term started, and I wish I did.
I bet that there's probably some military origins to the use too, there's technical way of just saying how we're moving people and such. Okay, so why are we talking about it now? You mentioned Sandy, and that's how you got involved with it, but a lot of people might think of it as a future issue. Well, okay, we might need to move from the coast, but you would argue it's a today issue.
Yeah, I think it's absolutely a conversation we need to be having now, if not a decade ago. And there's two real reasons. The first is that we're experiencing harms now, right? We have massive wildfires, we've got heat waves, we've got floods, we've had a record-breaking number of hurricanes making landfall. And there's a lot of people who are being hurt by those and who want out. They don't want to live through the next hurricane season. They don't want to rebuild for the 15th time. They don't want to go through this. Their kids don't want to go through this. They want out. And so we need a plan to help them get out, and to help them get out in a way that doesn't just put new families in the same risk, right? If we just let them sell on the regular real estate market, they're just putting a new family at risk. And so it doesn't actually reduce the problem. So that's what we need to talk about now. And the other reason is that managed retreat at scale is really difficult, we're learning, and doing it well is really difficult. We've been doing retreat, some people will point out, I'm sure in the comment section, that humans have been retreating since we became human. But as a country and formally, we've been doing it for at least several decades, and we're still just figuring out how to do it really well. So if we can look ahead and say, hey, by 2100 or 2070, we may need to relocate small towns or whole communities, we might need until 2070 to figure out how to do that well. Everything we do, putting seawalls in, putting beach nourishment down, it buys us time. And the question is, what is it buying us time for? And I think it's buying us time to figure out how to do managed retreat well. So, but that buying us that time is only good if we use that time. So great, we've got a couple decades, we built the seawall up higher, we've got time, now we need to use it to figure out how to do this well before we scale it up.
Well, I want to come back to that notion of scale, but I think of maybe just some test runs, and you think of flooding events along rivers, and like the National Flooding Insurance Program, the term for it, it's been in some ways a big failure. People keep going back and they rebuild in the same areas, and if that program was functioning properly, and I think there has been some reforms to really try to encourage it, but managed retreat away from these rivers, and what's your sense there? Are they making any progress?
So no, the
Okay.
Government Accountability Office came out with a report actually just this summer. Now I'm forgetting whether it's July or September report, but they came out with a report that basically says the National Flood Insurance Program hasn't been mitigating as many houses as it should. We haven't been buying up as many houses as we should. So they point out that the number of repetitive flood loss properties, so properties that flood and rebuild, right? Those properties, we've added 60,000 properties like that. And over that same time period, we've only mitigated the damage, whether through buying them out or elevating them or floodproofing them, we've only mitigated 15,000 houses. So that's an additional 45,000 more repetitive loss properties. That's more than the ones we've helped, right? So that means we're putting more people at risk than we're helping people who are already at risk. So no, the problem isn't working. The system isn't working. The problem's getting bigger. And this is one of the reasons I think we have to talk about managed retreat as a bigger scale and as a bigger project, right? It's not enough to just say, pick off one house here or there. We need to be thinking about this more systematically. And not only how do we move those houses out of the floodplain, but how do we prevent the next 60,000 houses from being added to the floodplain in the first place?
I have a bias towards sea level rise and coastal managed retreat, and I think you've is an area I think you focused on quite a bit too. And you know, where are we at in that respect? Would the scale be at the town level, the neighborhood level, or would it be at sort of like there's ways I guess you could have communities just unravel slowly in a somewhat organized way, and then there's economic considerations, there's climate, and I'm climate justice for sure want to touch upon, but do you have sort of an ideal kind of managed retreat for a certain size city that people can kind of get their heads around the issue with?
So, so I like to dream big,
Right, please.
right? So when I think about managed retreat, I think about New York City relocating. Okay, and I don't say this jokingly, right? I mean, New York City. What if over the next 100 years, right? Since think about what New York City looked like in 1900, very different, right? Horses and carts, not cars, no big. So what it looked like in 1900, and how different it's going to, if it looks that different from 1900 to today, it's going to look similarly different from today to 2120, right? In the next 100 years. So what if we spent that 100 years not just building walls to keep it the way it is, but to slowly invest in new infrastructure up in Westchester? What if we relocated the airport to north of the city and we started expanding subway lines out that way? What if we encouraged businesses to put their headquarters not in lower Manhattan where it floods, but up in the Bronx where it's on higher ground? And what if we did it in a way that didn't gentrify and displace all of those neighborhoods? Right? What if we did it in a way that created more equitable distribution of resources and access to things? So when I think about retreat, that's what I actually think about is like, how could we move New York City 3 miles north and do it over the next century in a way that helped everyone in the city, not just wealthy businesses or property owners? Obviously most people in the United States don't live in New York City, but I think we have to start thinking big scale like that.
So in that scenario, when you're talking about, well, let's move the airport and such, what happens to the old areas? Because you rarely are going to get a situation where it's completely abandoned, and then you've got that friction of like, well, what's staying? I mean, but in your thinking big scenario, what happens to those areas?
Yeah, so a lot of places around the coast, I mean, to pick on New York, and I don't mean to be picking on New Yorkers who are watching this, but to pick on New York, a lot of those areas were originally wetland. So can we return them to being wetland, right? Wetland absorbs a lot of floodwaters, it helps with storm systems, it provides a lot of ecosystem benefits. Aside of that, can we return them? Can we restore them? Can we do something with that space? And if we can't restore them to wetlands, can we do something with that land that then benefits the community? So the idea is not to have just an abandoned airport sitting there becoming derelict, right? But hey, can we use all this large flat space for recreational facilities, for a new central park? Can we do something beneficial with that land? I mean, even a big city park with grass on it would absorb more floodwater than a concrete runway, right? Can we do something with that?
Well, have you done that? And have you, you've probably been involved with scenario planning of various sorts. It's like, oh, you deal with the parks organizations. Like, let's create a map of the city where all these parks are, and you can sort of do that with what you're describing. But a scenario plan process would allow people to kind of visualize. Have you done that yet with like your students or with communities or anything?
So we do this occasionally in class, more as a thought exercise, right? What could it look like? Usually we don't do this with New York, we'll do it with like Delaware, right? What could we do in Delaware? If we relocated populations, what would it look like? Where would people have to go? But there are so many pieces involved in this that it would really, to do this well, would require a very big team. And that would require so much actual community engagement, right? Because you don't want me just sitting down and saying, here's the vision for New York, let's go, right? You want New Yorkers to come together and say, this is our vision of where we want New York to go. And similarly with Delawareans, right? So you need a huge team because you need to be thinking not just about where does the airport go, but how do all the transportation hubs connect to that, and where does the affordable housing go, and what do the city parks look like? You'd need so many people to be involved. But I also think that it's the reason I like thinking big like this is I think if you had a vision that was bold enough, it could get all those people excited to get involved. Yeah, in a way that saying, let's build a levee, I don't know, it's not quite as exciting and it doesn't get as many people thinking, oh, I have a role in that, I can get engaged. The way, hey, let's totally reimagine what it would mean to live in a city like this, or what it would mean to live in a coastal state. That can get people excited. And there's probably 15 people or more than that I would, have in my dream team that I don't even know that I would want them on my dream team, right? They'd have to come to me and say, hey, I have something to add. I'd be like, yes, that's an amazing contribution.
What about the U.S. military? And you think of communities like Norfolk that I get the sense they're taking it seriously, but you're never quite sure, and they're probably mapping out potential like managed retreat. Are you talking with military folks, and are they really serious about it?
So actually, the Navy, so I was a presidential management fellow at the US Navy. I got to work very briefly on the Task Force Climate Change at that point, Rear Admiral Titley. And it was really interesting to see how seriously they were taking climate change and the fact that, all of their assets are on the coast and at risk of sea level rise and flooding. What are they going to do about that? I think it's really difficult for them because on the one hand, they have total control over their infrastructure and they could, redesign anything on the base. On the other hand, they have, just like any city or business organization, right? They've got a million competing demands for all those funds, limited resources, and they're trying very hard, at least I get the impression they're trying very hard to be good neighbors to their community. So they can't just pick up and move a base because of all the implications that would have for everybody else around that neighborhood. So I know that they're working on it, but it's one of those, it goes back to why we need to talk about it now. These issues are so complicated and so integrated that it's going to take time. So I think they are working on it, but like anything else, it looks slow because they're trying to take it seriously and think about all the complications that are involved.
I don't want to interrupt, but we could edit this too. But the sun is shining on you is there a curtain you can pull down real quick?
Yeah, just 1 second.
All right. We'll edit this. Don't worry. I want to get you in better light. And perfect, much better. It was just blinding you on one side. Let's just jump right. And now we can see your Star Wars poster behind you too. So that's all good.
Excellent. Good.
So
show off my nerdy.
Let's talk about some of that. I like talking about the mundane issues around managed retreat too. And you think of the infrastructure that's left behind. And to me, we have future Superfund sites just waiting for us. Even being a gas station is going to be a Superfund site. What's, I guess, everything around when you think about infrastructure that you have to leave? What are the issues that we have to consider?
This is a really great question, and I wish I had more details for you. So in the US, most retreat happens through buyout programs, and those buyout programs will not move places unless they are environmentally clean. So they have an environmental site inspection, and they can only move if they are given a clean bill of health, or a clean environmental inspection. So we don't have a lot of experience with this, with figuring out what do you do about those contaminated sites other than clean them up and deal with them like Superfund sites, which means I think we're going to have to invest a lot more money and a lot more energy in cleaning those places up. Even our existing Superfund sites, many of them are in floodplains, where they're subject to flooding, which can spread the contamination and cause other problems. And we haven't prioritized cleaning even our existing ones. So it's a huge problem. How do we think about the next places? Some of the issues that come up are, do we move the house or do we demolish it? Right now, the primary answer is we demolish the house, often because after a disaster, it's already halfway destroyed. So, of course, you just demolish it. But then, what do you do with all that debris? There's some great buyout programs where people are, instead of demolishing it, they're going in and they're hiring local contractors to go in and deconstruct the house so they can reuse components of it. So as much of the house as you can reuse, let's do that, right? Take all those components rather than having a bulldozer come in. Let's take it apart by hand. It's more time consuming, it's more expensive, but it's also a lot better for the local economy, for the people who are working there, and for the environmental outcome. So there's things like that we can do. We can deconstruct. There's a movement right now about how we can we relocate homes? So relocating homes is incredibly difficult, especially in urban or even suburban areas. I mean, think about picking up a house and moving it. Think about every electrical wire across the street, right? That you have to try and fit a house under, or you have to deconnect and reconnect. All the complications that come with that. Going under any bridges, right? Doesn't happen. So just seemingly really mundane issues like that, like let's move this house, sounds great, actually really complicated. But there's a movement to how can we move these houses so we reuse more of these buildings that we already have, because that would help minimize our impact. Then, of course, you have the septic systems that are attached to any house. So removing those out of the floodplain can actually be an environmental benefit. If you think about it, like not having a bunch of septic systems in the floodwater can be a help. But again, time-consuming, expensive to take them all out and let that land rehabilitate.
And who wants to pay for that? Like if local governments feel like their community's unraveling, people are moving away, and just like, wait, you want us to go and spend money to take out all the septic systems too? Yeah, go jump in a lake. I mean, it's not going to be, it's going to be a federal response if you have to do it.
I think it's going to have to be federal or state, partly because when we think about this over time, right now, the federal government will pay, usually, most programs are up to 75%. There's exceptions, but mostly it's up to 75%. So if you think about a local community who has to pay 25% or even 12.5% if the state's matching, the more homes that they buy out, the more homes that they lose, the less property tax revenue they have as a town. So the harder it becomes for them to come up with that 12%. So the less likely they are to do more managed retreat. So it's almost like the first buyouts will be in some ways both the hardest because we won't know how, but the easiest because we'll have the most money in those places. The smaller those towns become, the harder it'll be for them to do this. And I think the states and feds are going to have to step in to help with that. And that raises another question of how can they do that productively? There's also all kinds of questions about, as towns shrink, can they merge, right? Can we have takeovers of large cities taking over smaller cities to expand more room for development? There's going to be all kinds of interesting questions about, and no small town wants to do that, right? No small town wants to give up. My hometown had a huge fight just over renaming 2 high schools that were still going to be where they were, right? Like, how do we merge them and who gets what name and how do we maintain it? It's a huge issue. So, merging 2 towns also is going to be a huge issue. But we might also have to move in that direction if we end up with these tiny towns that don't have enough population to really maintain their services.
I got some questions coming in from the community room from Kayla. And could we repurpose old infrastructure materials for the new construction?
I think that's a great idea. This is an area where I wish I knew more about the actual construction industry, but we do see examples of this. So I was just speaking to someone from Milwaukee, Wisconsin. So they have a program to actually do this kind of deconstruction so they can reuse as much as possible of the houses in new construction in new areas. And as a bigger comment, I should say that buyouts really need to be paired with comments about where the new housing is going to go, right? And that the fact that there needs to be new housing somewhere. We often talk about moving away from something, but we also need to talk about moving to something and what that looks like.
Okay, here's a question from Ken. Is most of the projected cost of managed retreat go to coastal communities? Has anyone ever analyzed this from the perspective of transferring wealth from Midwest to the coast as taxpayers subsidize the cost of retreat?
Yeah, so this is a really great question and one I'm very interested in. Working right now with some people at the University of Maryland to try to track disaster dollars and where they're spent. It's actually really difficult because of the number of agencies who are involved who are not FEMA. Right, we think about FEMA, but it's FEMA, it's HUD, it's US Army Corps, it's agriculture, it's energy, it's Department of Schools, right? Every time they rebuild a school, they get money. So it's really difficult to track. With retreat specifically, the bulk of retreat actually is happening in either the Midwest, right along the Mississippi and a lot of rivers in the middle of the country, or along the coast. So we do see a lot of retreat on the coast, but we also see lots of retreat around rivers. And there's discussion that we might start seeing more retreat on the West Coast due to wildfires. It's not, we haven't seen it yet, but there's potential. So yes, there's concern that we might have some of this wealth transfer going on, but it's unlikely to happen through retreat. It's more likely to happen through repetitive building of repeated flood loss properties through the National Flood Insurance Program.
Okay, here's a question from Brianna. When talking to people in flood zones, I often hear, where would you go that doesn't have some climate hazard? People reference the fires in California, tornadoes in the Midwest, etc. What is your response to that?
Yeah, everywhere in our country, someone did an analysis, and there's only like a handful of counties in the US that haven't had a presidentially declared disaster. So everywhere's had something, but some places are more at risk than others. Yeah, even within the same county. When we talk about managed retreat, I don't mean everyone should move to Iowa. I mean everyone should move 3 miles inland. Some places it may have to be more than that, especially on the Gulf. You have these very flat areas. You may have to move 50 miles in or 100. So you may be moving out of your county to the next county in. And are you going to be still at risk? Yes. But are you going to be as at risk or at risk as frequently? No. There's no place on earth that you can live that you're not at risk. Flood risk mitigation, disaster risk mitigation isn't about no risk. It's about reducing risk to a level that people feel comfortable with. And everyone has their own point where they feel comfortable about this. And everyone has a different thing that they feel comfortable about. Doug, you and I were just talking about our temperature, right? I grew up in Minnesota. I would not feel comfortable in a 90-degree day. That is not beautiful weather to me. That's too hot, right? So you're more willing to risk overheating, and I'm much more willing to risk getting hypothermia because we have different tolerances for that. Neither one's going to be risk-free. It's just what we want to accept. So when I think about managed retreat, it's not about having no risk. It's about moving to a place that has less risk and helping people move to a place where the level of risk that they are facing matches what they want to experience.
All right, so we're getting toward the end of this episode. We're just scratching the surface on this. We're getting you back for sure. I got some more questions in the community.
There's too much.
Right. I want to ask you, we're going to go into just chatting for a little bit, and I got some more questions, but I wanted to get in a question that managed retreat, there, just by the name itself, means that there's some sort of coordination, there's some thinking and structure to it. And I wonder, you think of, and I always think of Miami, and you've probably put a lot of thought into Miami too, is that, oh, well, they're doing it right. Look, they're discouraging new housing, and that's stage one. And there's just always the thinking about it. But then the whole notion of tipping points too. And it's just like the real estate values, and our friend Jesse Keenan, and I forgot to mention, Jesse wants us all to move to Duluth, right? We're all supposed to go to Duluth.
That's my hometown, so yeah.
Oh, really? I'm glad I wasn't knocking it yet. I'm not moving to Duluth, I'm sorry. But Jesse has been doing some research about fluctuations in the real estate market down there. And this is, what is a tipping point where the real estate market collapses and all of a sudden rich people want to flee Miami. And then the next group of people want, and it goes from being this managed things to like the economy collapses or it's an entropy kind of thing. And that's what I think probably is going to happen with, like, as you start managed retreat, it becomes unmanageable retreat.
Well, so I'm actually really concerned about the unmanaged retreat in exactly that scenario where we have a collapse of the coastal housing market. Because I do agree with Jesse Keenan and other analysts who have said, look, coastal property values are going to decline. We just don't know when, and we don't know how quickly they will collapse, but they are going to decline. And so if we don't have a government project to help people get out, then what I expect might happen is someone who's wealthy will sell their home to someone who's slightly less wealthy at a slightly cheaper price, and they'll sell it to someone else, and they'll sell it to someone else. And eventually someone will be left holding that hot potato, right? Someone will be left with a house that is effectively unsellable. And what are they going to do? If there's no government program there as a backstop to help them, they may just have an asset that becomes worth nothing. And I really worry about those people, because I think at that point, we may have a lot of people who really need that money that they've invested in that home. So I think we need a managed strategy, not to kick that ball off, but to be there at the end to help with all the problems that that's going to cause.
You open up a whole can of worms in your field there, AR. Good luck.
I know, there's so many.
No, seriously, and you have to decide, like, what area of expertise are you really going to drill in on too. You know, it's like I had wanted to get to some more climate justice issues. We don't have time for that, and that's going to be a future episode because that's a huge part of what you're doing. I do want to take you into just chatting, and I got a couple more questions I'm going to ask you in there, but this has been fantastic. And again, open invitation. We want you back on. Hopefully this was a good experience for you. But hold on, and we're going to go into just chatting, and we'll be right back. Okay, that was it. Let me ask a couple more questions here from Ken. Will residents of West Palm Beach be first in line, so to speak, for buyout dollars? Will they be made whole?
Yeah. So this is an interesting question. There's only been 2 studies on this, I think, so far, trying to look at where the money goes and who gets them and what's the demographics look like of who gets buyout dollars. The suggestion seems to be that actually low-income neighborhoods are more likely to get bought out than wealthy households. And we're not exactly sure why this is, but I think this is because if I gave you $1 million and told you to buy out homes, you're not going to go buy out that $1 million home, right? You're going to go buy out the $10,000, $100,000 homes to try to help as many people as possible. So you end up in neighborhoods where the homes are worth $100,000 or less, right? Mobile home parks where they're worth $10,000 and you buy up 100 of them. So you end up buying out more homes in these low-income neighborhoods. So will West Palm Beach be first in line? I don't expect so. On the other hand, politics, power certainly play a role in buyouts and where that money gets allocated, right? Which is just an unfortunate truth of how things work right now. And we need to do all we can to fix that.
If there's any constant in the universe, Florida will do it wrong when it comes to real estate. So that's my experience. What's your? I just want to be sensitive to you, John. But would you have a hard stop? Like, what's your schedule?
I do not have a hard stop.
Okay, so actually, I told you Brian is going to come on and we're going to talk. Do you want to stay? Let's have a 3-person conversation. Let's do this.
I'd
okay.
love that.
I wasn't quite sure if we would be able to do that, but we have it set up that we could do that really easily. Brianna, I know you're out there listening. Go ahead and dial into the Zoom, and we're going to just team up on AR here and make her very uncomfortable. But while we're waiting for that, I've got another question from Ken. Are there communities doing a better job than others? Are there policy responses that are showing particular promise?
Yeah, so in terms of buyouts, yes, some are doing better than others. Also, we're still trying to figure out what that means to do better than someone else. Yeah. Communication seems to play a huge role in all of this, in deciding how people adapt, whether they retreat, whether they accept buyouts, how the community feels about it, how it recovers. Communication seems to be really, really key. And one of the big issues is transparency. So knowing exactly what the government's planning to do, why they're planning to do it, whether it's mandatory, voluntary, etc. What the process looks like. People want to know all these details. And some governments are better at communicating that than others. So having a single spokesperson who can give a consistent voice, right, consistent information throughout the process seems to be really key to doing better in these processes.
Okay, so Brianna has joined us. We have to do a little tech stuff, so we might just hear your voice. Brianna, welcome to the show.
Hi, Siders. Good to see you.
Hey,
hi, Doug. Thanks for having me.
You know what? I knew this to call you Siders, right? I just keep saying AR, and you told me the Siders, and I thought I was on the inside of what your name was, and now I feel she knows you better than I do. So, okay. Siders. You told me this a long time ago.
I wasn't concerned, Doug. You're good.
No, but you told me this a while ago, and I should have introduced you as Siders. Okay, so it's going to take probably a minute here, but I'm going to just talk to both of you, but Brianna, maybe just introduce who you are. You've been on Simpatico before, but could you just give us a quick background?
Yeah, hi, I'm Brianna Castro. I was on Simpatico a while ago. I'm a PhD candidate at Harvard University in the sociology department. It's my 6th year. I think I have one more to go. And I work on the social effects of climate change, micro-level adaptation. So currently I'm doing research in coastal North Carolina with homeowners and renters, looking at how they're making decisions about moving, not moving, investments in their homes, and just dealing with climate impacts on the day-to-day. My other work's abroad in Colombia, where I looked at migration during drought. So a couple of sites.
And did you two cross paths quite a bit? You guys like...
Actually, when I was at Harvard, you were in Columbia, I believe. So we connected paths via email, but we were actually in Boston at the wrong time.
Yes, that's exactly right. And we've emailed a lot, but conferences ended right around the time I was back.
It was one of those, we should totally get coffee. Oh, no, we shouldn't. We should stay at home with masks on. Yeah.
And I think Jesse is probably a common denominator with all three of us too. So he's the Kevin Bacon of adaptation.
Absolutely.
We have to start giving Jesse a hard time about moving to New Orleans himself and telling everyone else to move to Duluth.
But is he really going to move there? Because
I don't know. Yeah.
Brian, it's great. We set this up, and I was originally just going to be you and me, but I'm like, you know what, we got to keep Siders on here. And so, what you think? What you think of what we talked about? Have you been thinking about managed retreat at all, or were there any questions that I missed? Let's jump right in there.
I thought it was a great episode, and I always love to hear Siders' perspective on managed retreat. And I think it's been really interesting for me in the context of North Carolina, where managed retreat looks like lots of dollars coming in after storms or maybe through hazard mitigation funds, and it turns into voluntary buyout programs where these households are still being chosen one by one. And in the counties that I'm working in, they both refuse the program. So very high risk, lots of damage, and the counties are saying we don't want anything to do with retreating or a buyout program. So how do we think about these scenarios? And I think there are like articles recently with these two counties in particular, Dare County, Hyde County, Tyrrell counties, and other, that they're on the top of the list right after South Florida for most impact from climate.
Well, and I find that always concerning too, because I wonder about the homeowners within those counties, right? The fact that a county has decided they don't want buyouts, does that mean that every homeowner in that county doesn't want to buy out? Or does that mean that the local government doesn't want to buy out? Because those aren't always the same thing, at least as we've seen in other locations. I don't know that that's happening in those particular counties, but I would be worried about it. Because the local government, Linda Shee at Cornell has been doing some great work on this, but the local governments in counties or cities have an incentive not to do buyouts. They have a financial rather than get houses out of the floodplain. And of course, the homeowners might want out. So I think that divide is really fascinating. And we don't know, right? Because what we know we have data on are the people who are bought out. We don't have data on the people who were offered and refused. We don't have data on the people who wanted one but were never offered one. So how do you find those people, I think, is really interesting.
I approached another county and have tried to talk them into letting me interview people who they're offering buyouts to, and they haven't said yes yet. But if you have any tips on that, like while they're still in the process of deciding, because I don't think we know enough about how homeowners make these decisions about when to approach them and if it's the best time.
Yeah, there's very little. Liz Kosloff's been doing some great ethnographic work around this, but she. Sherry Brockup-Binder, Alex Greer, right? But most of the studies on buyouts and accepting them are these statistical analyses. Like, here's the homeowners who accepted the buyouts. How do they compare to the general population? And that's hard to know because we don't have all the people who were offered and refused, right? So we don't have that counterfactual, and we don't have, and sometimes those studies disagree. Like, I love the studies that come out as completely different. This was a positive correlation, this one was a negative, who knows? But understanding why people make the decisions they do, really difficult and really interesting area more generally in climate adaptation, right? Not only managed retreat, but why do people make the decisions they do about adapting at all? Or even before that, why do people make decisions they do about buying a house in the floodplain, right? Did they know it was in the floodplain? Did they not care? Did they not know? Would it have influenced their decisions? There's so many of those aspects. Yeah, we have no idea.
Ron, did you go? I'm not sure why you would have gone, but there was the big managed retreat conference at Columbia about a year and a half ago, and I know Siders was there, and I went there very briefly. So did you go, Brianna? Were you there?
I did go, actually. So
okay, well, this is a question I'm just like, all right, would you? Both
Were
of
we
you.
all there?
Yeah, I was there for the main opening event, so I got all the free drinks and stuff. But then I had other responsibilities, so I didn't have to sit down and watch any presentations, which is always the best way to see a conference. But both of you, what are your thoughts on that event? And I know they're planning another one. Was it successful in the sense that I think it was probably the first real big managed retreat, and maybe Siders will start with you. But what were your thoughts on that?
I think the takeaway, my first initial takeaway, and I think everyone else's that I heard mostly was, wow, there are so many more people working on this from so many different angles that I didn't know about. And that was fantastic. Because a lot of people are, they're presenting on practical work they're doing, or it's stuff that's in the process of being published, right? So it maybe hasn't come out yet or hasn't come across my desk. So it was really fascinating to see all of the different aspects of managed retreat research that were out there. And then the other thing that was really striking was how little we actually know. We have a lot of questions. This is the hardest part about doing interviews like this, Doug, is like, oh, what about this or that? I'm like, man, I really wish I knew, right? All these questions. And And so everyone's working on it. I think that's why we need so many people to be working on it. But it's amazing to realize with every presentation, like, wow, you think we know that by now, but we don't. And that's fascinating. Like, so I think it was fascinating from the number of people who are working on it. The fact that the conversation happened at all was really encouraging, right? That we can have a public discussion about managed retreat is really encouraging. And then as an academic, it's nice to see all the gaps in the literature where clearly we need more work, right? So I'll still be employed working on this for a while to come, I think.
Forever.
Overemployed.
What was your impression, Brianna?
I thought it was great too. And similar to say, I didn't have any idea how many people were thinking about managed retreat. I think thinking about the conference afterwards, it kind of struck me that you start an intellectual conversation often with a big conference like that, where people meet each other. And I'm really looking forward to seeing what's presented this coming year, even though it seems virtual. I think I just saw the call for papers, and how many collaborations grew out of that conference last year and what's come since then. And I'm also wondering if managed retreat is the right term, if that's the right word. And I know these are never in fun conversations. Should we move to just talking about retreat? Because I think so many different things are being referred to now as managed retreat, and that was evident from the conference. What do you two think about that?
You go. Oh, okay.
You got a strong. Yeah. No, this is such a hard one. It's such a problematic term. Actually, someone in the audience at a talk I gave once came up and said we should call it aggressive resilience, because it needs a more like American and it needs a more positive sounding name. And so I was like, all right, aggressive resilience. I like this. We're not retreating. We're not losing. We're winning. This is a winning strategy. But no, it is huge problems. Yeah, right. Like, do we call it retreat or not is a problem, and then do we use the word managed or not is a problem. I often default to managed retreat because I think it's the lawyer in me, like it's precise in a way that relocation is not as precise, or migration or, displacement are not quite as precise as managed retreat. So I like that because I think there's value in distinguishing between retreat that just happens and people leave, right? People abandon houses and they move, or they sell to someone else and they leave, and the kind of programmatic, coordinated, supported effort. Now, within that, I think we do need better terms to distinguish between types of managed retreat. Absolutely. And frankly, if someone else wants to call it planned retreat or strategic whatever, fine. I'm on board. Yeah.
You got to factor in the public too. I mean, like throwing in the towel or something, that's not going to work.
Yeah.
I for the moment, I think I like managed retreat. Like planned retreat, just, I don't know, maybe a little bit too technical, but it's good for the next 5 years, right? It allows people in our orbits to sort of get our heads around it. And when we start really taking it seriously, retreat, I think there's a certain humility in that word too. It's just like, okay, we have to give up on some things, and we're going to just make it implied even from the term. And because all too often we just keep telling people like, oh, well, things will be better. It's like, well, if we have to abandon Miami, that's a pretty bad thing, but let's do it in a way that's just not as damaging as possible. And just, we have to be truthful with people. And so I like the term for the moment. I think it has its value.
What terms are used in Colombia, Brianna?
There's no managed or organized.
Yeah. So what? Okay.
Displacement,
so it's all
resettlement.
Okay.
Resettlement is what I often hear when you're talking about developing world moves, and it's usually related to development projects more so than environmental. It's just not as organized, and it's people. It's the unmanaged retreat is what I would call it, but no one else is calling it that.
We got some commentary in the community room. Ken's just like, let's call it inland attack. Americans will go for that.
Yes.
Like all the Midwesterners.
Attack the heartland.
It's like we're being invaded by all these, rubes from the coast and all that. So that's another way to think about it, though. It's just like that's going to create all sorts of issues. Who leaves first, and is there a race component to that? And are there clustering of populations that lead to trouble elsewhere? And I mean, again, these are some of the climate justice issues that we didn't get to talk about, but that's going to put a bomb under the notion of managed retreat too, if it just creates a bunch of resentment. Oh
yeah, it's going to be a huge. until we can have some nuanced, longer than Twitter conversations about what retreat should look like, what we want climate adaptation to look like, about racial inequality and discrimination in our country, yeah, it's just going to be a firestorm. Because there's huge problems if, like, imagine a community where we said, all right, we're going to relocate all of the African Americans because they're most at risk. They've been unjustly put in risky places and we want to help them. Well, that feels bad, right? Because that means we're displacing, we're breaking up all these communities, we're sending them inland, like, and it feels very top down. It feels like we're doing something to them as opposed to them being empowered to do something themselves, right? It feels very problematic. On the other hand, if we buy out all of the rich white people on the coast, right, and let them move inland, or we move them inland and we leave all of the communities of color on the coasts in the risky places, well, that also is bad. So it's not clear that the answer is, it's not clear that the answer is either or. And even just saying like, oh, let them decide is also its whole problematic because, well, how do they make that decision? Do we make an offer and then let them decide? Is it the government? Is it the households? How do you define these communities? It's a huge, I think it's a huge, I don't know, I'm trying not to curse. I don't have a word right now, but it's a huge problem. We have to untie.
Well, and then the other approach is when you have programs that require low to moderate income recipients of buyouts, and in certain parts, let's say rural North Carolina, those tend to be low-income African-American families. The result looks the same. Yeah.
Well, guys, maybe I have to think about just one more question for you, but before we need to sign off, we actually have another episode coming up. This has been fantastic, but any sort of, I will want to leave on a positive note, and Brianna, I want you to think about it. I'm going to go with Siders first, but I think our original conversation is like, if you're abandoning the coast, maybe you can, sell it that, this whole notion of national seashore, that, the land will be something positive that will happen to it, even if you have to abandon it.
Yeah, I mean, so this is why, I joke about moving New York City, but I think we have to think at that large scale because it opens up possibility. When we talk about moving a house or two houses, fine, we can create a community park, we can create a community garden, we can do something beneficial with that land, and that's exciting. But when we start thinking about what if we moved every single home on the coast inland by 1 mile, right, and created a national seashore where everyone could go to the park, or even state by state. Sure, we couldn't move ports or military bases, but we'd move, 80%, 90% of the coast. Heck, if we moved half the coast, it'd be amazing. We'd have huge open spaces, lots of natural buffers to protect us against storms, and this like amazing park where everyone could go experience the coast instead of only people who live on the coast can experience the coast. And I think we have to start thinking about that way. That's where I get really excited about Managed Retreat. Right? It isn't just, oh, let's run away from the water. It's let's do something cooler than build a wall. Like, great, that's fine. Or cool, we put your house up on 6-inch cinder blocks. But you know what? We could do something way more exciting. We could design a cool, eco-sustainable, dense city and then have huge open swaths parks where people could do interesting things. And I'm not a designer, I'm a landscape architect, but some of the most exciting stuff that I think is happening in adaptation are these kind of visions. And I think they're going to require some Managed Retreat to make space for these grand visions. And if we can sell it as not, oh, we have to retreat, but hey, we have a chance to do something amazing. And by the way, it's going to require retreat. To me, that's the excitement and the opportunity.
And Brianna, I want you to kind of quickly get the last word in if you had any thoughts on that.
I'll just say that in the qualitative research I'm doing, if you said if I talk about retreat, people really don't like that. But if I was to say, we need to move your whole community could move 1 mile inland and create this amazing opportunity, people would, I think, be on board with that. And I do think we often talk about migration and Managed Retreat in a way that makes it seem like further distances. People don't want to move far distances. So maybe it is just centering the conversation around the amount of space that would give us room to do something amazing like you're talking about, Siders.
Well, so guys, I hate to rush this off. We just have to prep for the next episode. This has been fantastic, and I just want to extend an invitation. I know I've talked to Brianna, but Siders, if your schedule permits, you see the schedule that we have for any given week. We have this Just Chatting where we just want to break down these episodes, and we just think it's a relaxed way to kind of go over the material that I just did an interview. So you please, and then more formal interviews, of course, always invited on.
Yeah. Well, thanks, Doug, for having me on, and Brianna. So nice to actually get to
Yeah.
talk to you a bit more in person. So, as in person
This
as we
was-
get these days. So, really
This was
appreciate it.
great. Thanks,
Awesome.
Doug. Great to see you, Ciders.
All right, guys, you can just sign out of Zoom. You have a great day.
Have a good one.
Bye.